All right. Hi, everybody, and welcome to Data Dialogues, hosted by Analytics 8. This is a monthly series that we do on LinkedIn Live, where we have a discussion on a relevant trend or topic in the data analytics industry. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kevin Lobo. I'm a managing director here at Analytics 8, and I lead our analytics service line. Tony Dolliger, who was originally supposed to be on the panel, was unfortunately unable to make it. So instead, my co-host today is our Chief Technology Officer, Patrick Minton. Patrick and I are going to be covering the topic of generative AI. I'm sure many of you joining have heard quite a lot about generative AI, ChatGPT, or large language models, and I'm sure many of you are wondering just where or how to start using it. Well, today we're going to be talking about practical use cases for leveraging generative AI, particularly within your data analytics projects, as well as a host of other topics. So with that, let's dive into the discussion. Patrick, you ready to kick things off?
Yeah, let's go for it.
All right. So we'll start with an easy one. What is generative AI?
Gotcha. I'm not sure if that's an easy one, but I think it's a good place to start. So it's generative AI is a type of artificial intelligence that learns from data to produce novel content, original content. So, we've seen a lot of these in recent years. Probably the one that's the household name now is ChatGPT,
Yeah.
where it's taking input from some sort of prompts and it's producing some sort of English output that is new and novel. And it's the amalgamation of all of the data from which it was trained. But there's been other types of generative AI that have been out there for a long time. So a lot of us on our phones, we have photo editors on our phones where, like there's the photo correction. There'll be generative fill in there. We've seen where we can do things to improve like sound recordings or generate new types of sounds. So all these things they're trained on types of data, and then they take some sort of prompt, and then they generate something new. So it's very much, and it feels a lot like the human experience. We have a bunch of experiences in our lives. Some of it's formal training, some of it's just coming into interaction with things in society. And then based upon some sort of prompt, we produce something new. And that could be anything from like an artist producing something new or just candid dialogue like we're having today.
So how do you contrast that with traditional AI or things that you see more kind of in the realm of, I guess, machine learning type projects, ML ops, kind of the traditional data science projects, I guess?
Yeah, good question. So, first of all, I already mentioned it. We're generating something new. The output of this AI is not some sort of number or prediction or something like that. It's new and novel content. So that's the biggie. But I think the part that makes this most exciting and the reason why it is such a household topic right now, because it's extremely complex, but why does everybody talking about it now, is because for the first time it's very approachable. Right now we can interact with it with just plain English. There are services, ChatGPT being one of them, where we can interact with it just through a web browser or from our phone. These are things that were reserved for data scientists and for many, many, many years. And of course, there's going to be maybe not of course, but for sure there will be need for data scientists and traditional data scientists for perhaps forever. But now there's this whole other realm where the kind of the general public can take advantage of AI. Then there's this room for specialists, which it's kind of a new term. I think the industry is still trying to figure out what it is, but the concept of an AI engineer.
Yeah.
How can we take these existing tools, and I think we're going to be talking about that a little bit more, and do things practically with it, rather than just doing a kind of a dialogue through ChatGPT over a browser.
So I think one thing that kind of stood out to me is that you were effectively saying that we've been using generative AI for a while, but the difference is, if I'm kind of paraphrasing, is it's on a much larger scale. There's a lot more nuance in what you can do today. Could you go into that a little bit more in terms of just examples that were generative AI that people were using prior to ChatGPT kind of being rolled out?
Sure. I think a key thing is I think vendors and software providers have done a very good job to date of not just labeling things with a big giant red button that says press here for AI. It's been baked in so naturally. It's just part of the natural interaction with things. So we've seen this in dashboards, for example, like the insights tabs. That's generative AI. I mentioned the photo editors on phones or in Photoshop. it didn't just say, there wasn't like a big flashing button that said here's AI. So it's been here for a while. The things that are new, um, or newish, is the large language models. So if we think of it, generative AI is kind of like a group of AI, something that's producing new and novel content. And there's types of generative AI under there. So some things for producing images, some things for producing sounds, some things for producing both of those. But what's new-ish is the ability to generate language out of it.
Mhm.
And the reason that is newish right now is because now they are actually at scale now. So language learning models have been around for a while, but the large language models are the big ones now. So the one that was the breakout was the GPT. Whereas before, these language models, they could have basically, in the order of billions of inputs. And if we think of these inputs and parameters as experiences, like in a human experiences that we've had in our life, basically these models have had a billion experiences. Now with not with Chat GPT
Mhm.
as the one that's the household name, these now have hundreds of billions of parameters. So we've gone from a situation, if we kind of try to equate the sophistication of these large language models to a human, the older models, they had about the experiences of like a middle schooler.
Mhm.
But now with hundreds of billions of experiences and hundreds of billions of parameters, it's like interacting with somebody who's halfway through their university career. So
Yeah,
that's the big difference right there.
yeah, and I think the scale of it was what impressed me the most when I started first kind of playing around with ChatGPT. Because to your point, these aren't necessarily novel concepts per se, but the first thing that I thought of when I saw ChatGPT was a lot of the early natural language processing visualizations that were baked into some of the early BI tools, right around like 2015, 2016, 2017. And I remember kind of interacting with them and being like, this is cool, but it doesn't have a whole lot of utility because of the verbosity and the richness, the type of analysis that you can derive from it just wasn't necessarily there at the time. So in kind of using ChatGPT, I was like, okay, this is a much different
Yeah.
scale. I've definitely seen this before, but this kind of completes the vision of what it was aspiring to be, 8, 9 years ago. Um, so I did want to transition a bit, and I wanted to talk about use cases. So I think everybody who's joining today or going to be watching the recording, they would probably say that it's relatively straightforward to write a prompt in ChatGPT to get going. But applying generative AI within an organization, within a corporate setting, is a lot more nuanced. So specific to data analytics, what do you see as some practical use cases that an organization can leverage to get started in using generative AI?
Sure. I think it's important to take a step back and talk about when and why and how to use it before we start talking
Mhm.
about use cases.
Yeah.
I think step one in adopting any sort of generative AI, be it something like a GPT or a llama or something that's producing language, or even something that's extrapolating images, is training and understanding where the processing is going on. So, as one example, if you are um, going to be using like an online one to backfill, something in your photograph, your digital
Mhm.
photograph that you uploaded. Well, right now you've just sent that photograph over to somewhere on the web, and it's out of your control now. Same
Mhm.
thing with like Chat GPT. Yeah, you may want to automate something or analyze some data. You could copy paste that in there, but now that's out of the confines of your corporate environment. So I think step one is training, is helping users understand what's going where.
Yep.
Now that doesn't mean you, and we'll talk about this here in a little bit. I assume is that doesn't mean you have to use these big multi-tenant, these big SaaS offerings in order to do it. But if you are, and when you are, just be very, very aware of what's going where, and the ownership of the data after you hit send in that prompt. So I think that's the first one is training, and then right after that is updating your acceptable use policies at work. Be they're here to stay. So now it's time to shore up your acceptable use policies to say, what can and cannot be used, what can leave the confines of the corporate network to go out there. So far, so good. Anything?
So far, so
Anything?
good.
Yeah. So if we talk about use cases from there, um, and knowing that hopefully by now, if you're using some, something that multiple users can hit, like a Chat GPT, how can we get value of it if we're not copying and pasting sensitive corporate data there? Well, a lot of them, and I think one of the is to help streamline some of the things that you're already doing today. So if we go back and think of a comment that I mentioned earlier, now these large language models, they have about the aptitude of like a college, somebody about through their college career. Well, what would you do with a college intern? What kind of things would you delegate to them? You would say, you know what? I wrote this code, help me go figure it, now do the documentation on it. Or here's a really long article, write me an executive summary.
Mm-hmm.
Or I don't understand this. Can you put it in a different language? I'm preparing for a presentation. Here's all the raw content, but I know it's going to go over all the audience's head. Kind of take this and then recalibrate it for my audience at a different level. So I think those are some real practical use cases that I can think of right away. But I know you've got some ideas. What are some that you've thought of, or you've actually seen us using already?
Yeah, I've seen a couple. There's a couple that come to mind. I love that college intern analogy, by the way. That was very good. But I think one practical application that I see, it's kind of more related to productivity gains. I think you can use text-based LLMs to convert code bases, so legacy code bases into a destination code base. So I see this having a lot of utility in migration scenarios. So in terms of our project work, in terms of a lot of projects that you see out there within the data analytics ecosystem, you might be moving from a legacy tool base, so let's just say Tableau, over to Power BI for an organization. And part of that project engagement typically entails refactoring a lot of the old code that exists within Tableau and moving that over to Power BI, converting a lot of the front end expressions in Tableau over to DAX. And ordinarily, you would need an individual that was at least conversant in both tools or had some sort of familiarity or was just really good at Googling. But the fact that you can effectively generate the expressions that you need gives you such an accelerator in terms of delivery, in terms of moving over a legacy code base to a new code base. And it's not going to always be one-to-one. You're going to have to do your due diligence,
For sure.
do your testing, make sure that the code is functioning correctly. But that's a huge productivity gainer when you're moving one tool to another. Another thing that I kind of look at is automations. I see a lot of power in automation. So there's a lot of lightweight application interfaces out there. So things like Zapier or Power Apps or Power Automate that can effectively leverage API calls to something like ChatGPT or an LLM that you might have within your corporate firewall. Conceivably, you can create something like a simple action and trigger response app. So think of situations where you're training your model to adopt the persona of a customer service agent or trawling a company intranet to kind of derive key information, and effectively just building a simple form and response application interface where people can just kind of type in what they need and auto generates the response. So, those are really low hanging fruit pieces, both from an application interface standpoint and a productivity gainer standpoint. And I see those being, really kind of straightforward, practical use cases that people could hit right out of the gate.
Yeah, that's right. But you brought up a super important part, and I think we've heard some horror stories in the news already. This is not a substitute for common sense. It's not a substitute for. It doesn't eliminate the need for testing and quality control and quality assurance. It's too early and perhaps never to just say this is what's being generated is 100% accurate. You still have to do the typical things: quality control, testing, validation. So all those things are super important point that we shouldn't forget.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, when you play around with ChatGPT, you'll kind of notice that the performance degrades over time as you're using it. So you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt. I think a quick call out in terms of practical use cases or just using large language models. The rule of thumb is effectively roughly 430 characters in terms of prompting. So, you have to have a certain level of verbosity in terms of what you're directing the model to produce in terms of result sets. So, there's a lot of things to kind of keep in mind as you're going through it and building it. I think one more kind of practical use case that I think is just kind of important to remember. A lot of people are using ChatGPT and LLMs to generate emails, to generate corporate communications. Like I see that quite a bit. And it's super important when you're doing that to have the concept of master prompting in place. So effectively, before you go ahead and start using ChatGPT to put together corporate communications, putting in a master prompt to define the tone in which you want the communication to come out, and defining what your corporate mission and values are, so that there's a consistent master theme in terms of how those communications are going out. So you don't have 100 different employees sending 100 different emails in 100 different tones from a boilerplate email for your company. So just kind of thinking of like the practical kind of blocking and tackling things that you need to do is going to be of paramount importance when you're kind of getting off the ground running.
Yeah, 100%. One thing, and this kind of goes into the training aspect, training of people using it, not the training of the models, is to understand kind of enough of what's going on behind the scenes to know where the gotchas are and where where the output of this model might be going in a slightly different direction than you expected it. So when you're using somebody else's model, and there's layers of abstraction in between them. So for example, you're using GPT-3 or GPT-4, and the skin on top of it is ChatGPT. There's a couple different layers there that you don't have control over. And so something you talked about the tone, and that's a very important thing, but it's also the bias of that.
Yeah.
So right now, these models are trained on, billions of inputs. Some of those inputs are parts of society that maybe are not in line with a lot of things. And so there are ways that the creators of these models and the creators of these skins on top of them have tried to steer those away from some of those more controversial positions. So something as I think people need to understand that lots of times, whatever you type into the front end of that, what gets sent to the actual back end model is different than what you typed in there. So some of the strategies that are being employed today, just kind of as a stopgap measure, it won't always be like this, is to modify your prompts. If you say, describe a successful business person to me, the prompt may append some stuff on there to make sure we're not getting like a racist output on top of that. And it's actually modifying the prompt that you typed in there. So, it does this in several different places. So when you talk about tone, you just understand that the prompts may be actually interpreted and doing something other than what you intended it to be. Now, again, that is if you were using somebody else's model. If you're using your own model or using a copy of a model, you have much more control over that.
Yeah.
So you can change the behavior of that. The other thing you can change, and I know this is something you're excited of, and I don't want to steal your thunder. We talk about this a lot, is training it on industry-specific data or data that's more specific to your company. So while I take a drink, why don't you take that one, please?
Yeah, for sure. I think there are a lot of practical applications for large language models, but for industry verticals specifically, where there's terminology and nuance and just kind of concepts that aren't going to be easily derived from a general use LLM model. I think another practical use case to kind of think about is using an industry-specific LLM. So an LLM that is trained on data that is specific to your industry. So there are a few that are out there. It's starting to get momentum. So a kind of general use example is Bloomberg GPT, which is basically their financial-driven LLM. So if you're working as a professional in finance, you might be more inclined to use something like Bloomberg GPT, as the data that it's being trained on is going to be far more relevant to those working within your industry, as opposed to something like a general use LLM. So that's another kind of big focus point that people should be aware of, that there are a lot of off-the-shelf LLMs that you can engage in, but picking the right one that's going to be useful for your organization, for your initiative, for your project is also really important.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably as good a time as ever to pivot to the concepts or the topic of technology. So most of our users, obviously, probably really well acquainted with ChatGPT. But what are some notable and unique technology related to generative AI that gets you really excited? What are some really cool, unique things that you're seeing out there today?
Well, the one that gets me so excited, and I spend an embarrassingly amount of my evenings playing with is actually taking these models and running them in my own environments. And that's something that I think we all, as an industry, will be doing very soon anyway. But the approachability of them, we talked about earlier the way for the casual end user to interact with them, that threshold has been lowered. But the same is true with the actual models themselves. So there are a lot of open source models out there, and a lot of them are actually optimized to run on commodity hardware. So,
Yeah.
are they going to be as performant as the hosted version of ChatGPT and GPT-4? Probably not. But you know what? I'll take a high school graduate uh, for free rather than have to pay somebody else like that, and
Yep.
one that I have more control over. So, a good place to get started for a lot of these people, for somebody more technical folks on there. I mean, you can go to huggingface.co to look at all of the generative AI models out there. Actually, all of the AI models out there, or a lot of them rather. Another place to get started, if you want to start playing with these models in your own environments, is GPT for all. It's a nice skin of it. It's really cool. You fire it up and it looks at the specs of whatever machine you're running on and says, this would be a good candidate for that. You probably don't have enough research for this. It's a really good guided way to get started on it, and it just really lowers that threshold because you and I have been talking about, I just retrain the model, put it on your own system. Like, what
Mhm.
does that mean? That's really daunting, but at least to get acquainted with it, this really lowers the barrier to get in. So that's what really gets me excited of it, is the accessibility from even a developer standpoint, and knowing that we don't have to be reliant upon the big, the open AI, for example, or we don't have to wait for Microsoft or Snowflake or Databricks to figure it out for us. We can get started now.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think people tend to kind of forget that there is that accessibility that they can kind of do the DIY approach, which is really unique and cool. But I think everybody kind of tends to default to gravitate towards kind of much the larger scale vendors that are out there. And I mean, I think from my standpoint, I think one of the cooler ones that I've seen was actually a demo from Google that I had the opportunity to sit through, which was kind of a combination of like a hybrid reporting model. So it was effectively a demo that was built in Looker. So kind of standard guided analytics, but it was connecting to a streaming real time data set that's basically showing traffic patterns, and then their off the shelf LLM kind of incorporated within the front end of Looker. So it's kind of a cool combination of kind of seeing like that ideal hybrid reporting model, as opposed to just like putting it into an LLM and just auto generating everything. I think one other piece that I've seen related to ChatGPT is the code interpreter feature, which obviously make sure that you have an acceptable use policy in place. Kind of do your research before you start putting your company P&L in here. But the code interpreter feature does allow for data uploads. And I think one of the unique characteristics about it is that all the data profiling that kind of comes with the territory and working in a data analytics project, and kind of understanding character counts, different column types, the different fields that you're interacting with. It can run that analysis for you. So again, another example of just being a productivity gainer, kind of helping to expedite pieces of the process that we as data practitioners tend to interact with every single day. So I think those are two in particular that I've seen recently that I kind of found unique and engaging. Um, okay. So, final question for the day. So, how do organizations start leveraging generative AI within their data teams and their overall data strategy? Like, where do they start? Is there anything that they should be focusing on in particular as they kind of start this journey?
Gotcha. So I think I just talked about, some how to start interacting with these models, and we talked about acceptable use policies and things like that, and training. I think those are all the places to start. Um, we also need to think about, we as an industry need to think about, and then on a more specific level, the application within an organization is the concepts of we've got to put this in terms of our data strategy. So
Yep.
right now, things like a data strategy and governance are more important than ever. What should be at inputs for this? What ethically is responsible for this? There's a newer role, the concept of a data ethicist that is rising in popularity right now. Because just because we can train a model on something, should we? And what should the model have access to? And if the model has access to this, is there a way that you accidentally expose something to a user of this model that they shouldn't have?
Mm-hmm.
So it all goes back to, and with almost anything in data and analytics, is do you have a sound strategy? And with that strategy, do you have a concept of data governance? So, we talked about some of the technical ways of going to, but I think just as important as some of the more softer prep work that goes along with that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it makes total sense. And I couldn't agree more. I think when you look at the output and the result set of large language models, what are people effectively looking to do? They're looking to make a decision off of it. It expedites the action of making a decision. And you have to have a sound basis for what that decision is or what that action is that you're deriving from the LLM. And a lot of that kind of goes back to your corporate data governance policies, your acceptable use policies, what's going into that training data set to derive the result set for that person to make a very critical decision. So makes total sense to me, loud and clear. I think from my standpoint, what that also ties into is the concept of data governance and just kind of the richness of your data. So the reality is people aren't going to be deploying ChatGPT, putting data on the open internet, kind of using that widespread across their organization. The reality is they're probably going to be using an LLM behind a corporate firewall. They're going to be using probably an off-the-shelf LLM provided through one of the big service providers, one of the big cloud hyperscalers. And the result set that they're going to bear is only going to be as good as the richness of the data and the supporting metadata that are contained within those data sets. You're not going to have the power of the entire open internet behind it kind of giving you all of the result sets. It's going to be very specifically honed in on your corporate data, and the results are only going to be as good as the quality of your corporate data. So I think it really puts a renewed emphasis on making sure that you have the proper standards and protocols in place to kind of populate what you need in terms of data sets, in terms of result sets, making sure that I hate this overworn term of all time, but I'm just going to use it, garbage in, garbage out. But it really applies in this situation, especially for training data purposes. Other piece of it, I think I touched upon it earlier, the domain use LLMs. I think those are a really important jumping off point if people are kind of considering where to start in their generative AI journey. As obviously training data sets on similarly grouped industries is going to be pretty relevant, especially if you have a very niche specific use case that you want to address. Okay, I'm going to take a quick pause and just see if we have any questions out there. Doesn't look like we do. Okay. Let's see. We have no questions, but we have one comment. DAX is so difficult to learn. To have GPT help me back then would have been a game changer. That I wholeheartedly agree. Again, the code generation piece of it, the migration piece of it, definitely a big productivity gainer. I see a ton of value in it. Saves you a lot of long nights reading through the DAX guide for dummies. But it doesn't look like we have any more questions in here, and we are kind of approaching time. So, Patrick, any other anything that you wanted to touch upon that we didn't today?
No, just parting thought is don't be afraid. It's approachable at many levels. Just start using it. Be careful with what you're doing. Just think about the sensitivity of stuff. But the more you use it, the more it's going to kind of unlock other use cases in your head. And so just start now. Just whatever and like I said, the more you use it, the more you're going to think of different applications of it.
So with that, we wanted to thank everybody for joining today. For those of you that are going to listen to the recording, if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to myself or Patrick. We are going to be publishing a blog post covering a lot of the topics that we discussed today. So again, thank you everybody for your time. Really enjoyed the conversation today, and hopefully we'll see you later.
Okay. All right. Thank you.